Okay, enough for me. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kelly Woodfield. Dr. Woodfield is a Utah native who grew up in Provo and is now a third-year OB-GYN resident at the University of Utah. She attended medical school at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and studied chemistry at both the University of Utah and BYU for her undergrad, and we are so excited to have her here with us today. Kelly, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, can everyone see that okay? Okay. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for letting me have this opportunity to speak with you all today. This is a real privilege as a resident. So, and thank you also for the introduction. So today we're going to talk about Utah's premarital exam. Okay, and then, so I have no financial disclosures, but just as a quick disclosure, this talk is about women, though I acknowledge that many of these issues that we're going to talk about today do affect men, transgender, and gender nonconforming individuals in ways that are equally or differently damaging. We just unfortunately don't have enough time to talk about them today. So the premarital exam is a phenomenon that we know occurs in Utah, and no one really knows when or why or how it started. All we know is that it's fairly common for young, often religiously conservative women to come to our clinic asking for one. And about 1.5 years ago, Dr. Jen Gunter, who's known as Twitter's resident gynecologist or the internet's OBGYN, she wrote a piercing expose on how the University of Utah was advertising premarital exams for women on their website. And in her post, she alleged overt misogyny on the part of the university in that there was no equivalent exam for men. There was an implication that a vagina needs medical prepping for sex, and that it was leading to the propagation of outdated and heteronormative notions of virginity. And unfortunately, her post garnered national attention, both within OBGYN social media circles, but also on a national scale to the general public through an article published in the Washington Post. So with that said, what I would like to accomplish today is to highlight the ways in which political and cultural forces have created a set of Utah values that, when combined, promote and perpetuate the premarital exam in our state. And in doing so, I hope to explain why the premarital exam exists, highlight ways that we can provide culturally sensitive care, and discuss what we as medical professionals can do to help advocate for change. So one of the reasons why I'm so interested in the premarital exam and this intersection between human sexuality and religion in general is actually from an experience that my mom had at her premarital exam when she was about 20 years old. So she got a premarital exam because her mom told her to. She had no idea what to expect, and she found it largely unhelpful, aside from learning that her body was not quite ready for sex because she had some sort of hymenal abnormality that required surgical correction. So she was very nervous for this procedure because she had been raised as a devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so no one, let alone a male medical professional, had ever interacted with that part of her body before. So she describes the day as finding herself on the operating table. She was naked from the waist down, and her arms were stretched out away from her body and strapped to arm boards, and her legs were up in stirrups, and she was completely exposed to the operating room. She said that her gown was also pulled down, was falling down in the front, and because her arms were strapped down, she couldn't fix it. And just before induction of general anesthesia, in walked several male medical trainees who she didn't know were going to be there, who politely introduced themselves as they're present to observe the procedure. She then fell asleep and then woke up in a lot of pain. So she didn't really think much of it, though she found the experience overall kind of humiliating. But it wasn't until she found a female medical professional several years later who helped her understand that what she experienced was a form of sexual trauma. Maybe not in the traditional sense, but was similar because she found herself in a situation where she lacked control over her body, which was a situation that arose out of a trust in her mom, a trust in religious teachings about sexuality, and a trust in the medical system. She said that this woman in some way acted as the mother figure she really needed at the time, because she was someone who helped her see that her premarital exam experience was a product of a culture that stigmatized female sexuality. And her work with this provider ultimately led to a life-changing realization that she had choice and was not beholden to cultural expectations of what it meant to be a perfect LDS woman. And so that's why I'm here today. It's to help unpack what's really behind these exams, and like this medical provider, hopefully start transforming it into something that empowers women instead. So I believe that this story and dozens of other stories I've heard about premarital exams show several key values that underlie the premarital exam. So these include: one, there's a time and place for sex, which is marriage. Two, there's propagation of potentially harmful sexual norms to women by women. Three, women are not the only agents consenting to their sexual activity. Four, there is a right way to have sex. And five, there is acceptance of a success sequence to sexual activity. And once again, we'll discuss the political and cultural influences behind each of these values and how they work together to create an ongoing demand for premarital exams in Utah. So starting with value number one, there's a time and place for sex, which is marriage. Much can be learned about premarital exams simply by analyzing the name. Arguably, a premarital exam is just any woman's first foray into gynecology, or just like her first gynecologic visit. But its name suggests that sex falls within the exclusive domain of marriage. So politically, we see this play out most prominently through sex education policy in Utah. So officially, Utah has an opt-in abstinence-based system, which is different than abstinence only in that there is an allowance to have a limited discussion on contraception as a means to prevent STDs and pregnancy. So this is in contrast to what's called comprehensive sex education, which is a very politically charged phrase in Utah, which is recommended by the CDC and includes discussions of sexuality, gender, how to obtain and use condoms, and consent. So culturally, the major player in Utah is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which I'll be referring to as the LDS Church for brevity's sake throughout this talk. So admittedly, when we're talking about a state's culture, there's innumerable factors that come into like a state's culture, but arguably the LDS Church is one of the biggest, as evidenced by the fact that nearly 70% of Utah's population is members of the church, and nearly 90% of Utah's state legislature as well. So I think it's important to pause here for a second and to note that premarital exams are strictly a cultural phenomenon. It is in no way a requirement or official policy of the LDS Church. And so in my family, when we're talking about the LDS Church, we find it helpful to distinguish between church doctrine, church policy, and church culture. And so throughout this talk, you're going to see this diagram with an X indicating where along the spectrum of a particular issue falls when we're talking about the church. So bringing back to culture, one of a central tenet of the LDS faith values system is the Law of Chastity, which is defined as sexual purity before marriage and complete fidelity to one's spouse after marriage. And scripture goes so far as to say that sexual sins are more serious than any other sins except murder. Examples of the doctrinal and cultural teachings surrounding this principle include delaying dating until age 16, avoiding impure thoughts, and avoiding a range of sexual behaviors from passionate kissing to intercourse. Members are also encouraged to dress modestly and to avoid pornography or media that can arouse sexual feelings. So not surprisingly, the zeal with which political and cultural institutions have discouraged premarital sexual behavior has also led to high levels of shame and inadvertently led to the discouragement of healthy, developmentally appropriate sexual behaviors, such as just normal sexual health discussions amongst family and friends, self-examination and exploration, and just a general knowledge of sexual mechanics and contraception. So as a result, a premarital exam may be a giant leap for a lot of women out of their comfort zone, which could have significant potential for embarrassment, anxiety, and misperceptions. Which leads us to clinical pearl number 1, which is if you are conducting or offering a premarital exam, it's important to take it slow and keep it basic. I think one of the most important questions that you can ask a woman is, what do you know about your own anatomy? And to not underestimate the value of using a mirror to help her see her own anatomy during the exam. So moving on to value number 2, there is propagation of potentially harmful sexual norms to women by women. So recently we had a patient present to our resident clinic who requested documentation of her virginity prior to her wedding night, which posed a bit of a dilemma for the poor resident taking care of this patient. And so she described the pickle she found herself in as, part of me is like, I'll sign whatever you need me to sign for your wedding, but then a part of me is like, I scientifically can't say if you're a virgin based on your hymen. So what in the world are we supposed to do in these situations? Unfortunately, I don't think that there's a right answer. I think, though, that in order to start navigating the situation, it's important to remember that many women in our state are socialized to operate within the parameters of a highly patriarchal system, and that survival sometimes depends on acting in ways that inadvertently reinforce beliefs that their value depends on how they can benefit men and male power. Thus, the persistence of the premarital exam into the 21st century, which is anecdotally an exam that women are encouraging other women to get, is an example of the role that women can unknowingly play in their own oppression. This patriarchal system is enforced politically through sexual education that promotes a damaging, stigmatized view of female sexuality. So it's written into law that Utah school districts need to use materials approved by the Utah State School Board or local school districts. So there's a number of available lesson plans online at uen.org. And as I was browsing through this website, I came across this horrific lesson entitled Funnels, where it takes students through what's called the intimacy and commitment funnels. And highlights in clear terms that men are highly sexual and that it is the woman's job to keep the couple from moving down the intimacy funnel. And so the lesson ends with this summary statement that says, girls and guys will use one funnel to bargain for the other. Girls give sex to get love, and guys give love to get sex. Teacher note, this statement makes a great poster for your classroom. So I think that there's so many things wrong with this, but most importantly, I think lessons such as this conditions youth to accept and internalize sexist attitudes about themselves. It also suggests that men are inherently knowledgeable and hardwired for sex, which might explain why women are seeking out premarital exams where they hopefully can learn things that seem second nature to men. So culturally, a patriarchal system is enforced within the LDS Church by the adherence to and defense of a strict religious and gendered hierarchy that leads to the propagation of potentially harmful beliefs about women by women. So just to explain, the church places significant emphasis on gender roles. Church doctrine asserts that gender is an eternal characteristic of individuals, meaning that the gender assigned to an individual at birth was one ascribed to them before this life and will persist with them thereafter. It's an important tenet to the faith because of the responsibilities given to each gender, where women are tasked with the bearing and nurturing of children, and men hold the priesthood, which gives them authority to preside over family and church matters. Officially, men and women are equal and cannot obtain exaltation without each other through a heterosexual marriage performed in a temple, also known as an eternal marriage. So these gender roles are essential in understanding the patriarchal authority structure of the church. So since only men can hold the priesthood, only men can serve in the highest callings of the church. Although there are women in decision-making capacities, they are always under the supervision of men. So it's a very hierarchical system with each of these levels answering to the one above it. And at the top is the president or prophet of the church who speaks for God. Although he's not infallible, there's tremendous loyalty to him, and adherence to his counsel is essential to maintain good standing in the church. So as a classic example of this loyalty to a religious and gendered hierarchy, Mormon women are credited with the defeats of the Equal Rights Amendment in Utah, Nevada, Idaho, and Virginia because they answered the then President Spencer W. Kimball's call to oppose it. And one historian described the phenomenon as Mormons defeated the ERA by merely flexing their considerable organizational muscle. So looping it back to politics, we see this fight continuing to play out at the Utah State Capitol through women-led conservative groups such as the Utah Eagle Forum and Pro-Life Utah, who represent some of the most systematic and staunchest opposition to comprehensive sex education and just reproductive justice in general in the state. So for example, in 2017, these two groups played an instrumental role in House Bill 363, which would have allowed school districts to drop sex ed entirely from their curriculum and require abstinence-only instruction in those that kept it. Fortunately, although it did pass the legislature, it avoided becoming law because Governor Herbert vetoed it. So bringing it back to the initial example of what are we supposed to do if a patient comes in requesting documentation of her virginity, it's really hard not to see this as a dichotomous choice between either standing up to the patriarchy or acquiescing to it. And like I said before, I don't think there's any right way of how to handle this situation, but I think if there was some sort of answer, it's going to lie somewhere in between the two, where like we as physicians help women exercise autonomy within the parameters of the patriarchal system in which they live. And so this is practically done through what's called value neutral counseling, where we use some of these phrases here to avoid paternalism and projecting our own belief system onto these women. And I wish there could be like a whole talk on how to do value neutral counseling, but unfortunately we don't have time. All right, so value number 3, women are not the only agents consenting to their sexual activity. So these agents include anyone who tells a woman when she is ready to use her body sexually rather than the woman herself, deciding based off of her needs and desires. So these other agents may include any religious leaders who are viewed as respected confidants or spiritual guides regarding many sexual aspects of a woman's life. They could be sexual partners or perpetrators who are never adequately taught consent, or it could be medical providers who are offering an assessment of a woman's physical and emotional preparedness for sex. So first, the cultural influence of religious leaders on sexual consent. So LDS bishops are local men asked to serve as the presiding spiritual authority over a ward or local congregation. So they're considered lay clergy, meaning they receive minimal formal training in how, aside from accumulated life experience, in how to execute their many responsibilities. So when one of the most important of these responsibilities is serving as a gatekeeper to the temple recommend. So this is a certificate formally acknowledging that a member is adherent to the central tenets of the faith and thus worthy to enter the temple. So basic conditions must be met, including adherence to the Law of Chastity. So as a result, bishops end up dealing with a host of confessions across the sexuality spectrum, including pornography, homosexuality, abortion, premarital sex, and premarital counseling, all with minimal to no formal training in sexual and reproductive health. So in a sense, these male bishops are acting as enforcers of the Law of Chastity and wield tremendous power in determining when and how a woman is sexually active. So as an example, in my own life, the first people that my partner and I told that we were gay to were our respective bishops. So my bishop was very compassionate and understanding and played a really important role in my life at the time. But my partner's bishop requested a detailed account of all the intimate behaviors she had undertaken up to that point in her life. And ultimately decided that she could keep her temple recommend and her calling as Relief Society president, as long as she never had an orgasm in a lesbian relationship, which seems kind of messed up to me. So also in recent years, the church has been criticized for permitting unsupervised bishop interviews with minors and other adults where sexual matters were discussed, though policies around this issue have changed in recent years. Also, the lack of robust training for how bishops should handle sexual confessions historically led to the propagation of conversion therapy for many LGBTQ members. In recent decades, though once again, policies around this issue have changed recently. So switching gears now to the political influences on sexual consent. In 2018, legislators passed House Bill 286, which requires sex education curriculum to include instruction in refusal skills and the harmful effects of pornography. Unfortunately, despite very moving testimony by a number of Utah teens, additional language that would have required instruction on consent was removed from the bill before it was passed. And also a similar bill was actually brought up in the last legislative session just a few weeks ago, and unfortunately also didn't pass. So consider this in the context that 1 in 3 Utah women will experience some form of sexual violence in her lifetime. Also, rape is the only violent crime that occurs in Utah at a higher rate than the rest of the nation. Furthermore, more than 1 in every 11 Utah students reported that they were forced to do something sexually by someone they were dating that they did not want to do. Also consider this, in 2018, Utah was ranked as the 2nd most sexist state in the nation, with women's own internalized sexism being the factor that pushed them up in the rankings. Also, just a few months ago, Utah was once again ranked as the worst state for women's equality when analyzing factors such as income inequality, number of executive positions held, political representation, and educational attainment. So interestingly, violence against women has been found to be highest in states where women and men were the most unequal. Furthermore, studies have shown that when men dominate family, political, economic, and other social institutions in both number and power, as they clearly do in Utah, the policies and practices of these institutions are likely to embody, reproduce, and legitimate male domination over women. And that is why premarital exams have persisted in this state long past their expiration date in the 1960s. So simply put, men have dominated the political and cultural dialogue in the state for so long that the forces acting to sexually disenfranchise women persist, even in medicine. But what if the solution wasn't necessarily to abolish the premarital exam just because of its misogynistic roots? What if we saw these exams as filling a unique need in our community and instead transformed them into something that empowered women instead? So I think Dr. Gunter put it really well when she said, if a woman who plans to partner with men has apprehension about her first coitus, what she and her prospective partner needs is quality sex education and a discussion about consent. She doesn't need her OBGYN reinforcing patriarchal tropes and medically incorrect information. So I really believe that we can use premarital exams as a tool of empowerment, not as a symbol of male dominance, by providing exams that are rich in education, safe places for questions, and grounded in evidence-based, value-neutral counseling about whatever it is the patient wants to talk about. Okay, so value number 4, we're moving right along. So there is a right way to have sex. So traditionally, one of the major focuses of a premarital exam was the pelvic exam, specifically to determine if a woman was physically ready to have intercourse. I personally have no idea what they would be looking for during this exam, but I do know that many of my friends were prescribed vaginal dilators for the purpose of dilating their vaginas prior to their wedding night. So there's a large amount of anecdotal evidence that this is a pretty widespread practice across the state. And so, for example, my sister-in-law recently told me that at her premarital exam just a couple of years ago, that was done at a large reputable private practice in Utah Valley, she actually received a centrifuge tube as a vaginal dilator. And according to this group's website, this seems to be pretty standard of care in their practice for premarital exams. Also, many of my colleagues and I have seen notes by older physicians that comment on a woman's hymen and classify it as either virginal or marital. Also, in my time in pediatric adolescent gynecology clinic, I was amazed at the number of moms who had questions about their daughter's hymen or were very worried that a medically indicated exam or procedure would disrupt the hymen. So this phallocentric phenomenon suggests that many people believe that there is a right way to have sex, which is penis and vagina intercourse. It also disregards evidence that most women don't orgasm with vaginal stimulation alone, and suggests that sex should happen only between men and women. So one very visible way that this plays out in our state is through LGBTQ issues. In 2016, legislators successfully passed Senate Bill 196, which removed sex education requirements known as the No Promo Homo Law, that prohibited instructors from discussing homosexuality in a positive way. So this legislation was passed as settlement to avoid court proceedings after Equality Utah sued the state school board and 3 Utah school districts. So the No Promo Homo Law had major consequences for LGBTQ youth because it not only limited access to vital information, but enabled abuse and discrimination at schools. Also in 2016, the Human Rights Watch conducted research in 5 US states, including Utah, on the experience of LGBTQ students in public schools, and they entitled their report, "Like Walking Through a Hailstorm." So in it, Utah students reported getting kicked out of class for bringing up homosexuality, or when it was discussed, doing so in a highly stigmatizing manner. Culturally, the LDS Church has a complex relationship with the LGBTQ community. They were strong advocates for non-discrimination legislation in housing and employment, but also had a landmark update to their handbook in 2015 that labeled people in same-sex marriages as apostates and barred children of such marriages from blessing and baptism until the age of 18. Although this policy has since been clarified, the church maintains that homosexuality is a sin and claims it distorts loving relationships and prevents people from receiving the blessings that can be found in family life and the saving ordinances of the gospel. So although members in same-sex relationships are no longer automatically excommunicated, according to the handbook, homosexual behavior still belongs to a group of sins, includes abortion and attempted murder, where a council to evaluate one's membership may be necessary. So there's some anecdotal evidence to suggest that the church's policies around LGBTQ issues have led to a possible rise in youth suicide rates amongst sexual minorities. Also, one 2017 study showed that among approximately 300 surveyed LGBTQ members of the church, more than 70% likely met criteria for PTSD at some point in their lives. So bringing it back to the premarital exam, this concept of a right way to have sex and with whom plays out in the blatant heteronormative qualifications to have the exam. So when individuals are socialized to believe that their first foray into gynecology should be before a heterosexual marriage, it leaves queer and transgender folks at the margins of care. Which leads us to Clinical Pearl 4.1, which is if we are going to offer premarital exams, they need to be rebranded as sexual health visits that are available to people of all genders and sexualities and regardless of their relationship status. It's also important to remember that LGBTQ youth are a particularly high-risk demographic, given the stigmatization of their sexuality and the institutionalized ignorance of safe, healthy sexual and reproductive health practices. Clinical Pearl 4.2 is it's important to also prepare for an answer for when people request a vaginal dilator. Because you will get them. You can also consider using this time as a time to correct misperceptions about the hymen. All right, value number 5. There is acceptance of a success sequence to sexual activity. So promotion of what one member of the state school board called the success sequence, or getting married before having children, is all over sex ed policy in the state and is entirely consistent with LDS church teachings. And it's implied in the pre-part of a premarital exam. So we see this from a political perspective, from what can and cannot be taught in public schools. So it's written into law that schools cannot teach the intricacies of intercourse, sexual stimulation, or erotic behavior, the advocacy of premarital or extramarital sexual activity, or the advocacy or encouragement of the use of contraceptive methods or devices, except as it relates to effectiveness, limitations, or risks. Unfortunately, I think many schools exceed expectations in this department, as one study showed that only 9% of Utah high schools taught how to correctly use a condom. Culturally, enforcement of sexual norms comes from the high state consequences of sexually deviant behavior. So take, for example, temples. As I explained earlier, a person cannot have a temple recommend if they have committed a sexual sin for which they have not yet repented. So being barred from the temple is a very shameful and stigmatizing experience, because you often go with friends and family members to worship there. And if you have to explain that you can't go to the temple for some period of time, a lot of people assume that it's because you've had sex. Or let's say that you've been invited to the wedding of a friend or family member. If you don't have a temple recommend, then you can't actually go to the wedding and you have to wait outside the temple with the little kids. So these social pressures create a high stakes environment when disclosing sexually deviant behavior. So this is particularly relevant when someone has been the victim of sexual assault, which we just learned that many women in Utah are at risk of. Because disclosing the assault often means disclosing sexual behavior and facing the aforementioned consequences. So this issue came to the fore several years ago when BYU students were being put on probation or even were expelled from school when they were disclosing sexual assault to their bishop or to school officials. As just one more example of how high these stakes are, a survey that Dr. Michelle Debink and I did earlier this year. So we sent out a survey to members of the LDS Church aged 18 to 50 that showed that of the nearly 1,500 respondents that were overwhelmingly white cisgender females, 9.2% reported thoughts of self-harm over their sexual behaviors, with 1.4% saying they had attempted to end their life over such. So to no one's surprise, many adolescents and young adults have found a workaround, intentionally operating in the gray area of what constitutes sex to avoid the need to confess their behaviors to their bishop. So for example, young adults in Utah have a very colorful vocabulary for what is not sex. And these include phrases such as parking, derfing, or marinating that they claim is not sex, but actually still puts them at risk of STDs and unintended pregnancy. So a premarital exam is just one more step in this success sequence to sexual activity. So this success sequence is culturally enforced by high stake consequences for sexually deviant behaviors and is reinforced through the limited scope of sex education in the state. And so together this leads to a dangerous combination of young people both misclassifying high-risk sexual behavior and possessing an insufficient fund of knowledge to realize the risks that they're taking. Which leads us to clinical pearl number 5, which is it's very important to ask, what does sex mean to you? Because people may claim that they're not sexually active when for all intents and purposes they are. It's also important to emphasize confidentiality and to screen for sexual assault. So there's clearly a lot of unhealthy and oppressive cultural and political forces that underlie the premarital exam. However, I also believe that there's some redeeming qualities to its existence. Most notably that some women use this as an opportunity for learning about their bodies and sexual potential. Thus, their presence at these visits is a recognition of knowledge gaps and demonstrates a respect for medically sound advice. So this was demonstrated culturally through a premarital exam ethnography done by one of our first-year medical students when she talked to women at BYU who were getting premarital exams. So she concluded that the primary reasons that these women were getting an exam was for contraceptive counseling and to obtain medically accurate information about their bodies. And they cited a distrust of internet resources, a reluctance to talk to their parents, and feeling like their peers were too inexperienced to provide medically accurate information as reasons for why they were getting a premarital exam. So from a policy perspective, it's written into law that sexual education needs to be medically accurate. There's also established guidelines requiring regular review of curriculum by school districts with committees made up of parents and health professionals. So to me, this screams potential and offers a glimpse of just how influential we can be as providers, both within a premarital exam, but also helping to change the political and cultural influences that have led to its existence. So if anything presented earlier in this talk has made you cringe, here is your opportunity to affect change in our community. So if you identify as a parent, sibling, relative, or friend of someone in the public school system, you can contact your local school board to determine what topics may be missing from local schools regarding sex ed, and to advocate for lessons on consent, sexual orientation, gender identity, contraception, and reproductive anatomy. If you're a citizen of Utah or whatever community you're from, you can always contact your local representative and ask them to support any bills regarding expanding comprehensive sex ed in our state. If you are a member of the LDS Church or a friend of its members, we can advocate for comprehensive training for LDS Bishops regarding how to handle sexual counseling and confessions. We can also advocate for up-to-date resources for how to teach sex ed in the home, because the most current resource is from like 1985, as well as promote a standardized evidence-based approach to teaching the Law of Chastity in formal church settings. Our position as medical professionals trained in topics of female sexuality and reproduction gives us significant credibility to lawmakers and citizens of the state. And so one easy way that we can use our expertise is to review approved sex ed lesson plans in our local school districts, and to also review the lesson plans on uen.org for medical accuracy. Also, as I mentioned earlier, sex ed often carries moral weight to both lawmakers and participants of the dominant religious culture in our state. So in order to maximize our credibility and impact in this context, we must have better data. We need resources allocated for research on the intersection of culture, religion, and sexuality to not only identify the unique needs of our community, but also present real evidence to decision makers about how legislative and religious policies are affecting its citizens. We can also try to impact how premarital exams are practiced across the state, and we can start by tackling the indiscriminate prescribing of vaginal dilators and dispelling misogynistic myths about the hymen. So I think we know how to be activists to affect political change, but I hope that this talk also showed that we need cultural change in this state as well, which is a much more delicate process. So I propose that the way that we change culture, particularly religious culture, is through the telling of stories. So today you heard several stories, including my mom's story. And I hope at some point you asked yourself what stories you had about this issue that you could share. So as medical providers, our voices are more likely to be heard. So we need to use these stories as a way of speaking truth to power. But more importantly, we also need to empower women to share their own stories about this issue, because we live in a state, so we live in a very patriarchal community where all too often a woman's power is determined by her proximity to men in power. But it's also a state that values women and will listen to them. So if we, together with Utah women, share stories of how premarital exams in their current form are harming their daughters, their sisters, and their friends, we will begin to see change happening to women by women. I strongly believe that Utah's greatest untapped resource is its women. So let's use them. So just to wrap up, I hope today that you've seen the political and cultural forces that explain why the premarital exam exists. You've learned some helpful tips to provide culturally sensitive care, and have learned what you, as a medical professional, can do to help advocate for change. Because to advocate for change and to empower women, because women cannot be truly empowered until they're empowered sexually. And I think premarital exams that are rebranded as sexual health visits that are available to everyone have the potential to make that happen. So just wanted to, before I end, just wanted to say thank you once again to my giant team that helped me create this talk, particularly Jen Kaiser and Annabelle Scheinberg. And I also wanted to thank Caitlin Quaid and the family planning and the folks at Family Planning Elevated for giving me this opportunity to talk. It's a real pleasure as a resident to be able to do that. Any questions?
Thank you, Kelly. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box or go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up. All right, last
hi.
questions.
Oh, sorry, it took me a minute to get myself on mute. Hi, Kelly. This is Abby, one of the midwives.
Hi.
Thank you so much. This was such a great presentation, and I really love the way you pulled it all together. My first job was in Utah County 15 years ago, and I had never heard of a premarital. I came from the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, and I was so confused. And the midwives there gave me an update on how to approach them, and everyone had a different way of doing it. It was really interesting. So anyway, I haven't seen many premaritals at the U like I did down in Utah County, and so I'm just curious what how this information might get out to the other OBGYN providers in the Utah area.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and one that we've been trying to brainstorm is like what we can do like for outreach to try to change this, because I think it's kind of, I'm sure, like a pretty sensitive subject as well. I know that so I'm involved in a couple research projects about premarital exams, just because we don't have any data. Like we don't know who does it, what's typically done, like what women are looking for in these exams. And so hopefully by like actually finding data and publishing that data, then we can have some like a ground to stand on in trying to advocate for change in this arena. Yeah, it's tough. And so if you have any ideas, please let me know.
I mean, one idea I have is there is a Utah ACNM midwife affiliate, and that meeting is quarterly, and this would be an amazing presentation for the midwives throughout the state. So anyway, I could talk to you more about it just for the midwife community, but this would be great information to share with other providers in the state.
Yeah, I would love to do that. So yeah, feel free to reach out. I'd love to do this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great idea.
Kelly, we had one question come in through the chat. What do we know about the prevalence of premarital exams outside of Utah?
Great question. We were actually talking about this a little bit beforehand. We don't. Everything we have is anecdotal. We know that this happens in Utah. We know that this happens predominantly in the LDS community. And so presumably along, what is it called? Like the Mormon corridor, which is like Arizona, Idaho. I'm pretty sure that, with the influence of BYU, Idaho as well, that it's probably happening all along the Intermountain area. One of our interns actually came from, I think it was North Dakota, maybe South Dakota, I don't know. And apparently there's also premarital exams there, which is like very removed from our culture. So I'm wondering if it's like some remnant of like rural America or something, but I do think that there are some unique values here in Utah that lead to its like the fact that it's persisted for this long, despite being, a little bit more urbanized in many areas. So It's a really great question, and we're trying to get the answer to that.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
I just have one other question, Kelly. Do you know what is currently being done in the state as far as lobbying lawmakers to change public health sex education?
I do actually. I was able to be pretty involved in this last legislative session, and there's a lot of people that feel very strongly on both sides of the issue, and so we're kind of at a stalemate. So the big issue this last time around was this consent bill. And it was really interesting to hear the arguments on both sides, because kind of like I said, like the Eagle Forum and these other like pretty conservative groups are, they really don't want to, like, they really don't want sex taught or sex ed taught at all. Like they think it should be taught in the home. And so it's really interesting to hear, because like when I testified in front of the House committee, House Education Committee, and I came in with like all of these statistics of like, if only we knew like what the sexual violence was in Utah, then like everyone of course would want to have consent be taught in schools. But the issue is that they felt like we were already teaching refusal skills, which is, I think, different than consent. And they're really worried about like the hyper sexualization of their children by having something like this brought up, especially, I don't know, it was just like a lot of really interesting arguments. And so there's a lot of work being done, but it's really hard. It's very politicized. And that's why I think that, you know, the avenue that we might need to take is maybe not so much, it's continuing the fight from a political perspective, but it's changing it culturally, which is why I think these stories, you know, stories of assault, stories of, you know, women who are very ignorant about their bodies or about sexual mechanics coming into our offices and saying, this needs to happen in public schools. If it's not happening in the home, public schools need to supplement this. And like I said before, like we as doctors, like they listen to us. I was amazed, like I'm just a resident. And there was so much respect for the title of like doctor in the room. And I think that anyone with experience in healthcare is going to carry like pretty much the same weight. So yeah, good question.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right. Thank you. One moment, and I will take over the screen share here and give some final information. Great. So for those interested in claiming one CME credit for this webinar, we'll be emailing out the code and instructions for claiming your credit once you've completed your post-webinar survey. If you've set up a CME profile with the University of Utah before, the process is very simple. You can just call the phone number to enter your event code. If you haven't set up a profile with the university before, you'll be asked to complete a brief form before you can claim your credit. The one thing that we do want to emphasize is the CME credit must be claimed before midnight tonight, at which point it will turn into a pumpkin. We'll be sending an instruction guide, which should answer most of your questions, but don't hesitate to email if you need any more assistance. And as mentioned in the chat, we will be sharing these slides and it will be posted, the webinar as a whole, on our website as well. And finally, we ask that you complete our post-webinar survey. Just like the pre-survey, there are a few different ways to get there. You can type the URL into your browser, click on the link in the chat box. That should be there from the beginning, and I believe we'll be posting that one more time. Or you can use your smartphone camera and hover over the QR code. And I apologize for that. The music started a little early, but I did want to make sure that I tell you that we hope you'll join us monthly for new topics in our webinar series. And next month on April 12th at 11 a.m., Dr. Joseph Stanford will be presenting on a primary care approach to infertility. So thank you all. We appreciate your attendance and take good care of yourselves. And with that, I will leave you to the survey. Thank you.